Okay, let's read Rambler number 25 by Dr. Samuel Johnson for Tuesday, June 12th, 1750. The title is Rashness Preferable to Cowardice, Enterprise Not to be Repressed. It opens with a little Latin here. Passit quia posse videntur by Virgil. And then a quote. For they conquer who believe they can. Dryden. Let's start. There are some vices and errors which, though often fatal in those whom they are found, have yet, by the universal consent of mankind, been considered as entitled to some degree of respect, or have at least been exempted from contemptuous infamy, and condemned by the severest moralists with pity rather than detestation. A constant and invariable example of this general partiality will be found in the different regard which has always been shown to rashness and cowardice, two vices of which, though they may be conceived equally distant from the middle point where true fortitude is placed, and may equally injure any public or private interest, yet the one is never mentioned without some kind of veneration, and the other always considered as a topic of unlimited and licentious censure, on which all the virulence of reproach may be lawfully exerted. So that's rashness and cowardice, two ends on the other side of fortitude. Rashness and cowardice, yeah. And the one is revered, no, not revered, but at least admired, and the other is reviled. That's the word. The same distinction is made by the common suffrage between profusion and avarice, and perhaps between many other opposite vices, and as I have found reason to pay great regard to the voice of the people in cases where knowledge has been forced upon them by experience without long deductions or deep researches, I am inclined to believe that this distribution of respect is not without some agreement with the nature of things, and that in the faults which are thus invested with extraordinary privileges, there are generally some latent principles of merit, some possibilities of future virtue which may, by degrees, break from obstruction, and by time and opportunity be brought into act. It may be laid down as an axiom that it is more easy to take away superfluities than to supply defects. And therefore, he that is culpable because he is past the middle part of virtue is always accounted a fairer object of hope than he who fails by falling short. The one has all that perfection requires, and more, but the excess may be easily retrenched. The other wants the qualities requisite to excellence, and who can tell how he shall obtain them? We are certain that the horse may be taught to keep pace with his fellows. Whose fault is it that he leaves them behind? We know that a few strokes of the axe will lop a cedar, but what arts of cultivation can elevate a shrub? So I guess it's better to start off with material that is has an excess of qualities that we can then par down, than one that is lacking. An interesting observation. To walk with circumspection and steadiness in the right path, at an equal distance between the extremities of error, ought to be the constant endeavor of every reasonable being. Nor can I think those teachers of moral wisdom much to be honored as benefactors to mankind, who are always enlarging upon the difficulty of our duties, and providing rather excuses for vices than incentives for virtue. But since to most it will happen often, and to all sometimes, that there will be a deviation towards one side or the other, we ought always to employ our vigilance, with most attention on that enemy from which there is the greatest danger, and to stray, if we must stray, towards those parts from whence we may quickly and easily return. Among other opposite qualities of the mind which may become dangerous, though in different degrees, I have often had occasion to consider the contrary effects of presumption and despondency, of heady confidence which promises victory without contest, and heartless pusillanimity, which shrinks back from the thought of great undertakings, confounds difficult with impossibility, and considers all advancement towards any new attainment as irreversibly prohibited. So there's that middle ground, and then on either side these various characteristics which seem to acquire some character of vice in their very substance and nature. And he's talking about being able to find your way back. If you're going to go in one of the directions, go in the direction from which you can find your way back relatively easily. Presumption will be easily corrected. Every experiment will teach caution, and miscarriages will hourly show that attempts are not always rewarded with success. The most precipitate ardor will, in time, be taught the necessity of methodical gradation and preparatory measures. And the most daring confidence be convinced that neither merit nor abilities can command events. That's the principle of maturity. One of the principles of my Good Life Creed in operation right there. He says, every experiment will teach caution, and miscarriages will hourly show that attempts are not always rewarded with success. And then he goes on to build upon that, showing how that happens. Interesting. It is the advantage of vehemence and activity that they are always hastening to their own reformation. Vehemence and activity. That they're always hastening to their own reformation. Oh, they lead easily back to because they lead to folly quickly, I imagine. Because they incite us to try whether our expectations are well grounded, and therefore detect the deceits which they are. Because they incite us to try whether our expectations are well grounded, and therefore detect the deceits which they are apt to occasion. Interesting. Vehemence and activity. They serve as a test to see whether what we think is true actually is true, because they precipitate results. And thus they hasten us to our own reform. But timidity is the disease of the mind, more obstinate and fatal. For a man once persuaded that any impediment is insuperable has given it, with respect to himself, that strength and weight which had not before. That's heavy right there. Timidity is a disease of the mind, more obstinate and fatal. For a man once persuaded that any impediment is insuperable has given it, with respect to himself, that strength and weight which it had not before. So the timid, by seeing something as difficult or impossible, without it, even if it's not, give it that quality and character by virtue of that timidity. This dovetails nicely with a new sub-principle that I'm going to add today, actually, to the Good Life Creed, to the principle called the risk of avoiding risk. I'm going to call it risk management, and comment on the fact how we actually do that very thing. We decide that something is too dangerous to try, or we decide that we simply don't want to incur risk, and so we simply stay with the safe and sound. I'm going to put a note here. This would be then risk management. I felt bad at first marking up this in pencil, these 200-year-old volumes, but hey, they're mine. And I love it when I find other people's marks in them. He can scarcely strive. Let me do that part again, and we'll carry that part forward. But timidity is a disease of the mind, more obstinate and fatal. For a man once persuaded that any impediment is insuperable, has given it, with respect to himself, that strength and weight which it had not before. He can scarcely strive with vigor and perseverance when he has no hope of gaining the victory, and since he never will try his strength, can never discover the unreasonableness of his fears. Wow! There is often to be found in men devoted to literature a kind of intellectual cowardice, which, whoever converses much among them, may observe frequently to depress the alacrity of enterprise, and by consequence to retard the improvement of science. Okay. There's often found in men devoted to literature a kind of intellectual cowardice, which whoever converses much among men may observe frequently to depress the alacrity of enterprise, and by consequence to retard the improvement of scientists. An intellectual cowardice. Tell us more, Dr. Johnson. They have annexed to every species of knowledge some chimerical character of terror and inhibition, which they transmit without much reflection from one to another. They first fright themselves and then propagate the panic to their scholars and acquaintance. So imagine a teacher talking to his students about the fears he has, some capacity about the things that they're studying. I don't quite get it yet. One study is inconsistent with a lively imagination, another with a solid judgment. One is improper in the early parts of life. Another requires so much time that it is not to be attempted at an advanced age. One is dry and contracts the sentiments. Another is diffuse and overburdens the memory. One is insufferable to taste and delicacy, and another wears out life in the study of words, and is useless to a wise man who desires only the knowledge of things. So this is interesting how the scholar then applies characteristics to the various subjects, and then, like he said, imparts those to his scholars, his students, so that they wind up in this, I imagine picturing like a museum of learning, where every item is in a glass case, afraid to be touched or handled for its various qualities that are to be avoided. Interesting. I'd never thought of that. Here's a word I don't know. Bugbears. What the heck is a bugbear? But of all the bugbears by which here's some Latin, infantes barbati. But of all the bugbears by which the infantes barbati, boys both young and old, I guess it's infants, barbati. So maybe something to do with old. Boys, both young and old. But of all the bugbears by which the infantes barbati, boys both young and old, have been hitherto frighted from digressing into new tracks of learning, none has, so all the things that scare them away, none has been more mischievously efficacious than an opinion that every kind of knowledge requires a peculiar genius or mental constitution, yes, framed for the reception of some ideas and the exclusion of others, and that to him whose genius is not adapted to the study which he prosecutes, all labor shall be in vain and fruitless. Vain is the endeavor to mingle oil and water, or, in the language of chemistry, to amalgamate bodies of heterogeneous principles. I get it. Right. So just read that first part again. But of all the bugbears by which the infantes barbati, boys both young and old, have been hitherto frighted from digressing into new tracks of learning, None has been more mischievously efficacious than the opinion that every kind of knowledge requires a particular genius, a peculiar genius. So we need a certain type of person. Certain types of people are mathematicians, are good or suitable for math or science or literature or the arts, whatever the case may be. And then that would then, if you're front loaded with that presumption, then it preclude you from thinking as a scholar, as a young student, that you might be successful at such a thing. I know the big effect that had on me in my life's course, where I wanted to be a biologist, and I was dissuaded. I turned away from that because I became of that exact opinion that I did not have the character or the mind for math, which may be true, but I think Dr. Johnson's onto something here too. This opinion we may reasonably suspect to have been propagated by vanity beyond the truth. It is natural for those who have raised a reputation by any science to exalt themselves as endowed by heaven with peculiar powers, or marked out by an extraordinary designation. Hold on, I'm losing this. Try this again. This opinion we may reasonably suspect to have been propagated by vanity beyond the truth. So I guess he's saying there may be some truth to it, right? But the opinion gets pushed past that truth. That opinion before about that there are certain characters for certain sciences and arts. It is natural for those who have raised a reputation by any science to exalt themselves as endowed by heaven with peculiar powers. So those who are good at something say, well, it's by God's grace. Or marked out by an extraordinary designation for their profession, and to fright competitors away by representing the difficulties with which they must contend, and the necessity of qualities which are supposed to be not generally conferred, and which no man can know but by experience whether he enjoys. So those that rise to fame in some capacity in academic fields then mark out their territory, saying, it's by the grace of God, and by the way, if you try to go this path too, you're going to need certain characteristics of X, Y, and Z if you're going to succeed, and that then dissuades and keeps the arena clear of competitors, human beings. To this discouragement, it may be possibly answered that since a genius, whether it be, is like that a genius, whatever it be, is like fire in the flint, only to be produced by collision with a proper subject. What? Hold on. To this discouragement, it may be possibly answered that since a genius, whatever it be, is like fire in the flint, only to be produced by collision with a proper subject. It is the business of every man to try whatever his faculties may not happily cooperate with his desires. And since they whose proficiency he admires knew their own force only by the event, he needs but engage in the same understanding with equal spirit, and may reasonably hope for equal success. One more time. The whole paragraph. I think I'm getting it. To this discouragement, the discouragement of the scholars who wave them away by fears, to this discouragement it may be possibly answered that since a genius, whatever it be, is like fire in the flint, only to be produced by collision with a proper subject, so the two things come together, and then the genius sparks into flame. It is the business of every man to try whether his faculties may not happily cooperate with his desires. So every man should try, even if he thinks that he doesn't have an aptitude for it. He should give it a try, because the genius may spark the flame. You can only see if it's going to spark the flame by collision with those elements of interest. And since they whose proficiency he admires knew their own force only by the event, and since those who have succeeded only knew it by the fact that they tried, he needs but engage in the same undertaking with equal spirit and may reasonably hope for equal success. Bravo, Dr. Johnson. Encouragement to give it a try, even if you think you don't have the aptitude. There is another species of false intelligence given by those who profess to show the way to the summit of knowledge, with equal tendency to depress the mind with false distrust of itself, and weaken it by needless solicitude and dejection. What? There is another species of false intelligence given by those who profess to show the way to the summit of knowledge. Here's the way. Come, I'll show you. Of equal tendency to depress the mind with false distrust of itself. A species of false intelligence given by those who profess to show the way to the summit of knowledge, of equal tendency to depress the mind with false distrust of itself, and weaken it by needless solicitude and dejection. So I guess those who kind of just doubt themselves, right? And it's by those who profess to show the way to the summit of knowledge. So someone is saying, I know how to succeed, but then they just have this depressive attitude and false distrust of, that doesn't, I don't quite get it yet. When a scholar, whom they desire to animate, consults them at his entrance on some new study, it is common to make flattering representations of its pleasantness and faculty. Thus, they generally attain one of two ends, almost equally desirable. They either incite his industry by elevating his hopes, or produce a high opinion of their own abilities, since they are supposed to relate only what they have found, and to have proceeded with no less ease than they promise to their followers. Do I understand this? It's a species of false intelligence given by those who profess to show the way to the summit of knowledge, with equal tendency to depress the mind with false distrust of itself. So they're showing the way to knowledge and then inciting in others a distrust of themselves by needless solicitude and dejection. I'm not sure I quite under what solicitude means. When a scholar whom they desire to animate consults them at his entrance on some new study, so a student says, I'd like to become a biologist, it is common to make flattering representations of its pleasantness and faculty. Oh, I'm the scholar, I'm the teacher. Oh, you're going to love it. Biology is great. It's terrific. Thus, they generally attain one of two ends. So then, two ends, almost equally desirable. They either incite his industry, and so the student is encouraged, by elevating his hopes, or produce a high opinion of their own abilities. So then the professor the student thinks well of them, and they think well of themselves, since they are supposed to relate only what they have found, and to have proceeded with no less ease, than they promise to their followers. Oh, I guess it's false intelligence because it's only showing the one side of the object, right? The flattering side, which yields the effect of showing the person who's professing those things. That's like I had that experience yesterday. I was talking to someone about Stoic philosophy, and I was professing all the positives about it, which made me feel like, wow, I know something about Stoic philosophy. It's exactly, I was experiencing that. I was on the reckless side of that yesterday. Interesting. The student, inflamed by this encouragement, goes on. The student, inflamed by this encouragement, sets forward in a new path and proceeds a few steps with great alacrity. But he's very encouraged, and off he goes. But he soon finds asperities and intricacies of which he has not been forewarned, because all he got was the positive side, right? And imagining that none ever were so entangled or fatigued before him, not thinking that it's just him, sinks suddenly into despair and desists as from an expedition in which fate oppresses him. Thus his terrors are multiplied by his hopes, and he is defeated without resistance, because he has no expectation of an enemy. He has no expectation of an enemy. He had no forewarning. He wasn't foretold by his teachers how difficult it would actually be. Interesting. I get it. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So we're near the end. Of these treacherous instructors, the one destroys industry by declaring that industry is vain, the other by representing it as needless. The one cuts away the root of hope, the other raises it only to be blasted. The one confines his pupil to the shore by telling him that his wreck is certain, the other sends him to sea without preparing him for tempests. Wow. False hopes and false terrors are equally to be avoided. Every man who proposes to grow eminent by learning should carry in his mind at once the difficulty of excellence and the force of industry, and remember that fame is not conferred but by the recompense of labor, and that labor, vigorously continued, has not often failed of its reward. Well, I wonder. Let's try that again. That's the end of the essay. But I wonder about that last part. The whole paragraph again. False hopes and false terrors are equally to be avoided. Every man who proposes to grow eminent by learning should carry in his mind at once the difficulty of excellence and the force of industry, and remember that fame is not conferred but by the recompense of labor, and that labor, vigorously continued, has not often failed of its reward. That's worth underlining, but I would wonder, he's got a broad definition of fame there, doesn't he? Or he has a narrow definition of fame, actually. That definition would be maybe the fame of the academic, perhaps, the scientist. I mean, certainly fame is passed out in spades nowadays here in the modern age, and just look at TikTok fame. Very good. I really enjoyed this one, and I enjoyed this new process. Instead of just the reading of it, I'm trying to stop and digest it as I go along the way. I hope you don't mind me doing that, but it's been helpful for me to understand better, not just to get through the end of the thing and go, what the hell was all that about? I think I actually understand it better. Thanks for joining me. Take care.